I was listening to Sarah Carasano, who used to work here at CTC. She was in this dialogue between her CMO, CFO, and a CEO about, do we present the 50th percentile? Do we present the 75th percentile? Like, what do we go to? And the content was around this idea that, like, interwoven in that is that the person that you're presenting it to has something that they want you to say, right? And how it was like, she kind of felt like she got thrown under the bus. This happens all the time, where we bring a number to somebody and they dismiss the output. They say, like, okay, that's not good enough. I need more revenue or more profit. And when I talk with our people about how to manage that situation, I go, okay, table the output and now bring up the inputs.
If you're a D2C founder who's sick of losing chargebacks, then you'll love Chargeflow. Their AI-powered system recovers chargebacks on autopilot, and the best part is that you only pay when they win your disputes. If not, you won't pay a dime. Ready to add bottom line revenue on autopilot? Get your first 100 chargebacks handled absolutely free. Just visit chargeflow.io and enter the code CTC100 after activation. Hey folks, welcome to the Ecommerce Playbook Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Gaffin, Director of Digital Product Strategy here at Common Thread Collective. And I'm joined, as I always am, by our CEO, Mr. Taylor Holiday, representing the New York Yankees organization today.
No.
Taylor, what's going on?
It's Coach Holiday to you, and I'm representing the Costa Mesa Yankees, who have a makeup game today at 5 p.m. against the Costa Mesa Padres. So that's why I'm in uniform. You're going to have to be at the field early today.
I see. Okay, gotcha. Getting yourself in the coach mindset throughout the entire day, right?
Well, just saving myself having to drive home and change. That's the practicals of it.
So here's the question: which Yankees team does the Costa Mesa Yankees look most like? Is this 2000s Yankees, Jorge Posada, Jeter?
Well, so our league gave us the worst. Like, you'd think if you're a little league and you're going to provide uniforms to kids, you're going to give them the pinstripes, right? You got to give them the pinstripes. No, we have grays, the all gray. And the gray pants don't match the gray jersey, so we're not the most stylish version of the Yankees you've ever seen. So whatever version is that? Maybe it's like the 80s Mattingly Yankees or something.
Oh yeah, there you go. Cool, man. All right. Well, so today what we want to talk about is, this is kind of an anticipation of another Sharpen Your Skills episode that we have coming out later this week. And of course, for those of you who don't know, Sharpen Your Skills is the series that we just started putting out, where Taylor draws pictures on a piece of paper that represent very important e-commerce tactics. And it's a super useful way of kind of demonstrating some of the stuff that we talk about. But this upcoming episode, we're going to be discussing, well, kind of more broadly, the idea of an e-commerce intervention. What does it look like to kind of intercede in this difficult time for e-commerce generally? What are the things that need to be put in place to actually begin growing again? But what we wanted to kind of draw out from that particularly was the idea of the role that accurate forecasting plays in kind of pulling your e-commerce business out of the type of tailspin a lot of businesses are in right now. So obviously we talk about forecasting a lot here, so there might be a little bit of retread, but I think we want to kind of pull out specifically how accurate forecasting can help save your business. And I think that's maybe the angle we want to take here. So
yeah,
Taylor,
I want to connect a couple ideas for you. So this week's episode. So one, if you aren't a subscriber on YouTube, we'd love for you to be. Get on there so that you can get the videos. We're dropping them every Friday. We've got 5 in this season. It's technically season 3. We're calling it season 2 officially, but there was a prequel if you were an early subscriber. But be there, because we're on to the 3rd episode this week, and we're going to be recreating a piece of content that was initially a talk that I gave at a conference about the D2C evolution that we're sort of calling the e-commerce intervention. And if you think about an intervention as a premise, right, it's sort of the idea that somebody or someone has a problem, and we need to awaken them to that issue and offer them the opportunity to deal with that objective cold reality, right? Like that's, and when I think about the role that we often at CTC are asked to play, is customers are coming to us, generally speaking, not because everything is rosy and going to the moon, although there are those cases, but for the most part, there's some challenge that is leading them to pursue an alternative service provider. And many cases, our role in that situation begins much like an intervention. And that comes in the form of a forecast, and a forecast that's rooted not in desire, but in data. Our first job is to tell them what is likely to occur if nothing changes. What is the data telling us about the degradation of your new customer acquisition efficiency, about the state of your existing customer file? When we put that all together against your present cost structures of the business, here's what the future looks like if you do nothing new. And that is sort of the intervention moment that forecasting plays, is that, and this is why I think having a third party without any of the underlying incentives that usually lead to people overestimating the forecast provides you a point of view on the future and to show you the underlying models that are creating that reality and to deal with the math is a really important intervention moment for brands to stop and go, okay, where are we right now? Absent any of the desires that people have of where we want to be and any of the pressures they might have to overrepresent the state, but to get a really cold view of this is where we are right now. And it's not to say that that's going to be bad, but it's just to say an objective third-party assessment of where are we today is a really important step to then building a plan that gets you to where you want to be. And so that intervention moment is what a forecast has the opportunity to represent and what many brands right now, I think, need, because they're carrying with them an old forecast or a forecast that's maybe rooted more in desire than data, and they're operating within that. And it's forcing them to what it actually forces you to do is not change your behavior enough because you have this underlying belief that things are actually better than they are.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you point that out because obviously in the intervention metaphor, the first step to recovery is admitting that you have a problem. And that's sort of what the role the forecast plays, or at least defining exactly what the problem is. But it's interesting that there's this dynamic where brands are coming to us in the first place because they do sort of know that they have a problem. But then they're also bringing this forecasting that says, like, actually, maybe we don't really have a problem, or things aren't as bad as they seem.
Or there's this dissonance between the individuals in the organization, right? Yeah. Where someone might be sort of trying to sound an alarm and they're using us to help them do that in some ways versus maybe what the board wants or what the different parties may have a desire for. And so sometimes we're helpful in bringing that clarity, whereas internally, because if you think about it, like if you're a head of marketing, it's really hard to go to your CEO or CFO and say, it's not working, it's not going to go well, right? Like you have every incentive in the world to never say that, right? And so, or vice versa, if a CMO does say that out to a CEO, it's really hard for the CEO to accept it and not go, no, do better, right? So, so internally within an organization, there's all these conflicting incentives for how the number gets to where it should be, right? And so sometimes what we are is just like another data point to get to where are we currently. And again, we're not suggesting that the initial view is where you want to be. And oftentimes we like to say that the gap between what is likely to occur and what you would like to occur is what strategy is. But the problem is we can't develop the right strategy unless we can all agree on what is presently true. And so, because it often really reframes how dramatically we need to act in the future relative to how much we need to change the present state.
Right. Okay. So the role then that, kind of summarize the role that accurate forecasting plays is to define what is, right? To define what the playing field is, what the map looks like, what's likely to happen if nothing changes. But one thing that we were kind of talking about a little bit before we hit record is this idea that accurate forecasting doesn't equal growth. Like obviously this is only a first step. So talk about kind of where things go from there, I guess.
Right. So it may be accurate in a forecasting exercise to say that you're going to shrink next month. But when we give that forecast to a client, they're never going to want that. Nobody wants to pay for me to make their business get smaller, right? So what we now have to do is we now have to sort of decompose what are the most immediately movable inputs of this model, and then how do we set goals about improving the underlying attributes to beat the model. So we talk all the time about set the model, break the model. And we want to outperform the historical view because a model is often just an extrapolation of the past, right? So it's taking what has been true recently and saying, okay, if things continue on this trend line, what occurs? And so we want to break that. We want to create deviations from the historical reality. And so that allows us to begin to look at, okay, what would need to true to be more efficient on new customer acquisition or increase new customer acquisition volume? How could we improve our returning customers and outperform those curves? What new marketing moments can we create in the future to do both of those things simultaneously? And so we begin to look at all the different inputs that we have the potential to affect. We set goals that begin to push the model. Because when you think about like any modeling exercise, it's not a binary thing, right? You could take every input and put it on a spectrum from the 99th percentile outcome to the first percentile outcome. And you could set the targets or expectations for the likelihood of achievement on that spectrum, right? So I think what we're often doing with clients is sort of negotiating to the expectation of where we sit on that curve. And we're going to have conversations around, all right, well, what assets do we have to improve the historical media efficiency? What new products are coming? What marketing moments? What other things are going to occur such that we have reasonable expectation that we're going to outperform the past? And so we want to build in actions that create a reasonable defense of outperforming the model and then hold ourselves to that contingent on those actions happening. And so that's the dance all the time is here's the model, here's the spectrum of possibilities. Now let's talk about what we're going to do together, what the strategy is to outperform that baseline expectation.
Right. Yeah. And maybe the irony here is that like the goal itself may not change. Maybe somebody comes to you and say, we want to grow X amount over the next few months. Our model shows that that's not going to happen. But what we can do is build a path towards that.
That's
perhaps, right. As opposed to just saying kind of arbitrarily, we want to grow this much and we're just going to kind of make it happen. However,
that's right. Changing horizons is a really important part of this process where nobody ever wants to just be told you can't have this growth goal. Right. And so oftentimes you have to work with them to say, okay, we're going to get it, but rather than in 4 months, it might be 9, or rather than that being the 1-year goal, that might need to be the 3-year goal. Right. And I think that's a lot of what this era and moment represents is like adjusting horizons. We recognize that every business wants to grow and we believe that's important and we should be in pursuit of that. But in many cases, there's like so many different steps that go into it. It may involve like, we may need to completely reset the OpEx. We may have a bunch of old inventory that we have to move through and get back to cash. And some of these processes don't just happen overnight. It's not like you can just immediately take a bunch of bad inventory, clear it all out, buy a new one, have it all ready to go, have it be on trend, on moment, perfectly priced, all those things. This stuff is often a sequence where some of the congestion that has occurred in the business may take a while to flush out. And we have to build a set of steps that are going to get us to that expectation in the future.
Yeah. Okay, so I kind of want to jump over then a little bit. Speaking of, I guess, forecasting being an anchor to reality or a connection to reality. One thing that we're kind of doing internally a little bit, we may end up releasing publicly, I'm not sure, but it's kind of based on something that our head of growth accelerator, or our growth accelerator program, Joy, does, which is releases kind of a report card of how all of the clients that are kind of within his suite of clients are doing relative to their goals. And this is something that we call the profit system report card. And the idea is to look at all of our clients and kind of understand where they are relative to where we predicted they would be. So tell me about what the kind of value is of looking at that information in aggregate and how that helps us kind of refine this forecasting process.
Well, the first thing is if we're going to sell you on the idea that we're going to help you forecast accurately, we need to defend that statement and we need to hold ourselves accountable to measuring that. And so we want to just look at, okay, how did our system perform in the process of attempting to accurately forecast revenue, right? So we set goals for all of our growth strategists in this process that success is plus or minus 10% to target. So we like to think of forecasting as an exercise of being closest to the pin, right? It's not actually good to substantially outperform or underperform the model, right? Because that e-commerce is such a game of like predicting inventory volume, buying for that volume, selling at a specific volume, like in a way that the more consistent you can be at that, the easier it becomes to run the organization. So I want to look at this across the entirety of the system. So I can see for the month of February, for example, that we were plus 5% to revenue across the whole organization, plus 6.85% to spend. So we were of target. We were 5% above target on revenue, 6% above target on spend for the entire organization across everybody that we have. Now, what we also do is we break it down by individual growth strategists, because a lot of what being a good growth strategist is negotiating and managing the expectations of the individual clients, as well as a bunch of individual decisions that get made. Now, we have a good amount of the process that's dependent on the data science team and the modeling exercise, but there's still some very human decisions that go into the process. And there's also execution. We like to say that forecasting is an exercise in execution as much as it is in modeling. So when we look at this, what I'm able to do then is to think about our system in the same way you would think about improving AI or any model that exists, which is reinforcement feedback through human learning, right? So we can look at it and go, okay, I can see across all my growth strategists, we had a range that went from the lowest was minus 13% to target, and the highest was plus 22% of target. So every growth strategy sits along that spectrum. That's the total bound of outcomes from minus 13% to plus 22%. And the best being, we had somebody that was in less than 1% of target. That was like the best. So
Mhm.
I can go into each of those scenarios and ask questions about, okay, what did we miss? What client were we wrong for? What was the scenario? What happened? Were we optimistic? Where were we too optimistic, and what failed to occur? When we were pessimistic and we missed under, what did we not consider? And the answers to those questions become ways that you can improve your model. Maybe we need to have a better consideration for inventory positions before the months start, and being able to infuse that data into the modeling can help us to correct for issues, because most often forecasting goes wrong when a product runs out of stock or wasn't in stock, or or was delayed in the launch date or whatever it might be. Or it's like, oh, email is substantially underperforming consistently, or Meta's underperforming consistently. We can find areas where across the system there are inputs that are consistently off, and then we can use that to reinforce the model from the start. So you can sort of root update the whole system on the basis of constantly learning where you're ahead or behind.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, well, a couple of things. So like one, this is just out of curiosity. It's like what are the factors that play into a forecast being too pessimistic? It's kind of like an interesting sort of counterintuitive thing. Like, oh, we beat it so much. That's incredible. But actually, where'd that go wrong, I guess?
So in our world, the bias that we have to fight against is our growth strategists are often hedging, right?
Mhm.
Nobody wants to set an expectation that's too high and then miss it by a lot, right? Like that's the disease that we're trying to help fight. So you can sort of swing that pendulum too far, whereas like a clever growth strategist will be good at convincing their client in some ways to take too low of a target, right?
Mhm.
And so there's this balance that you have to do on both sides, which is to press for growth, right? To set a expectation up that curve, up the bound of possibility, and move everyone towards it aggressively. So I think that can be a piece of it. Other things that will happen is that all sorts of unanticipated creation things that occur, like a big PR hit, and unexpected influencer posts, where you get these big spikes in revenue that weren't part of the marketing calendar. They were sort of unplanned or unexpected revenue. And those just offer you the chance to go back and go, whoa, that's interesting. Could we have known? If so, why didn't we know? What were we missing? What point of communication? Oh, the influencer team's not actually plugged into our communication flow. So we could have known that there was a schedule of posts, but we didn't have access to it. Okay, so you could maybe update that as part of the planning system. Or, there are things that are truly unplanned. I think about the moment that Blenders had where Deion Sanders, showed up and was wearing those glasses at a conference, and like that became a big, like things like that happen all the time. Taylor Swift is seen wearing your product, whatever, So those kinds of things do occur. And then sometimes you have an ad that just pops off. It does way better than you anticipated. Your product drop, the model that you had for anticipating how well that demand would go was wrong. So there's all sorts of ways that you can be wrong to the upside for products all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So talk to me then about like, back to the idea of looking at this information in aggregate. And you'd mentioned the idea that like having this kind of like overarching or sort of 10,000 foot view of the data gives us the opportunity to change the way we think about the system at large, right? So is there a circumstance, I guess I'm asking, where we're missing in a certain way consistently across a number of clients, and therefore there's something about the system itself that needs to be revamped?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I look at this, and I'll just let's say this month on the contribution margin side, we were plus 25% to target. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's too big, right? Like that to me says we left meat on the bone for growth in a lot of places. And if this is my number one critique of our own system right now, is that we need to make sure that we're being more aggressive in pressing for growth, especially in the cases where we're ahead of expectation. The one thing that targets can do is that they can sort of get you to this place where you go, oh, I'm hitting it. I sort of leave well enough alone. Mm-hmm. Versus going, especially like with contribution margin, I'm not saying that necessarily. What you want to do in that case is you want to like book future revenue. And so what do I mean by that? Like if I have contribution margin excess, I think of that like surplus of financial assets that I want to invest into longer term growth. So let's say I outperformed contribution margin expectation by $100,000. I would like allocate a portion of that excess to more top of funnel or longer term investment channels to make sure that next month's result is guaranteed as well, right? So I wouldn't take that and try and allocate towards like a sale or a transactional moment, but Could I do some lead gen for email capture? Could I take a really good brand asset and move into like a YouTube test or something like that, where I could now maybe pair some tilling up of the future soil? Could I take that and book some influencer posts for the next month with that excess $50,000? And to think of it like an investment portfolio where I don't want to just take that $100,000 and put it in my checking account, right? Because I actually didn't need that money. Now, I'm not to say to take all of your surplus. Like, I'm okay with like taking extra profit is cool too. But at the same time, I want to reinvest that money. I want to put it back in to tilling up the future soil. And I think that's where I'd like to see our growth strategists be a little bit more aggressive. It also signals to me that maybe like we don't have all the costs considered exactly right on the margin side. So I really want to go back and check the data integrity of the cost, which is really hard to get right for every brand, and make sure that we trust that number a ton and it's something we feel really great actioning against. So in every case, I want to try to understand what's happening and what does that teach us, and what could we go investigate a little further as well. The other thing I'll say is that our spend, like if I think about the revenue deltas being from minus 13% to plus 22%, the spend deltas are more dramatic. They run from minus 15% to plus 42% in some cases. And so it's like, that's a wider range of outcomes on the spend side. And so that's another thing I want to go interrogate a little bit. Like, okay, what is happening that's making our spend a little bit wider of a result? Because it's not just like the average isn't, it's also the bounds are really important, that the tighter that we can get that, the more consistent our work is across the portfolio. So those are all really important things for us to sort of pull on and go, okay, what happened here? How do we tighten up these bounds so that ideally not only do the averages get closer to zero, but the range gets closer to zero as well, so that we're more right more often?
Yeah. Okay. So this actually, you may have answered this question a little bit, but my tactical, practical question, which I do kind of like to finish us off with for this particular conversation, was going to be like, where do you see, like, given this aggregate data and then your general experience with forecasting, where are people most likely, what metric are most people most likely to miss on, in what direction? And then like, what's the thing that you do to kind of mitigate that, I guess?
I think in forecasting, people focus way too much on and have their internal organizational arguments around outcomes. So like revenue is an outcome, profit is an outcome, and not enough around the inputs. So as an example, I was listening to Sarah Carasano, who used to work here at CTC. She's creating a bunch of cool content right now. And I was listening to a TikTok where she was talking about how she was in this dialogue between her CMO, CFO, and a CEO about, do we present the 50th percentile? Do we present the 75th percentile? Like, what do we go to? And the content was around this idea that like interwoven in that is that the person that you're presenting it to has something that they want you to say, right? And how it was like, she kind of felt like she got thrown under the bus in this scenario. She's describing whatever. You can go check out her content. But this happens all the time, where we bring a number to somebody and they dismiss the output. They say like, okay, that's not good enough. I need more revenue or more profit. And when I talk with our people about how to manage that situation, I go, okay, table the output and now bring up the inputs. Okay, and let's discuss, where do you think I'm wrong? Which one do you think I'm being too conservative about? Here's my returning customer expectation and where it comes from. Here's the curves. Here's the model. Here's where it's at. Here's where we've been the last few months. Here's my new customer acquisition. Here's my budget. Here's my efficiency. Here's where it sits in the model. Here's where I'm on what percentage I'm at. And if you think I'm wrong about my returning customer revenue number, why? What? Because, and do it through the lens of, help me learn to be better, to understand what you're seeing that I'm not seeing, right? So what do you have in your head that's telling you that this is going to be way bigger than that? Like, and let's talk through it. Oh, we're going to spend more on existing customers. I don't think you're considering that portion of it. Or, hey, I think the drop on the 27th is going to be huge, and so it's going to be different than we didn't have that drop last year, whatever. And if you can move the argument out of the outputs and into the inputs, I think you're going to have much more productive conversations. That's actually going to force the organization to defend desire. And this is like, I think the thing all the time is that just because we want it to be so doesn't make it so. We have to really force ourselves to ask how we're going to get there. What is going to change? And this is where, again, like, not to plug us, but that's kind of the point of the podcast here, is that it's really helpful to be a third party in this moment. It is just one of the ways in which we can enter into an environment and provide you a POV that is just not rooted in all the historical, emotional baggage of an organization. It's just really hard to do that. And so CEOs, like, I think in particular, I would almost always, on your annual planning process, have a third-party view that you can use to comp against what your team's telling you. Because either we're going to come back and say that your team's sandbagging a little bit, or your team's being too aggressive, and they might be just like telling you what you want to hear, and you might be setting the organization up. So anytime, if you're behind on your expectation through Q1 and it's time for a reset, use us as a resource to that. Or if you're way ahead, same thing. And especially in any annual planning process, I know everyone's fiscal calendar is a little different, but I would almost always want a third-party POV to that exercise. It's the same thing companies do in the diligence process. Like imagine you were doing diligence to buy a company, and all you did was like take the company you're acquiring's forecast. Like you would never do that. You would never do that. Why would you never do that? Well, because they have every incentive in the world to give you the rosiest picture of what's going to occur. That's often true for your internal team too. So the reason you go through a QOE, or the reason you often bring in a third party to assess when there's an acquisition occurring, is because that objectivity, that lack of attachment to the outcome, it's not my goal. It's not my KPI to provide you a forecast. It's not my job at stake. And so it's so helpful to layer in that set of information to help give you that POV. That's why it's the intervention moment.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was going to say that brings it nicely full circle in that, like, if we start off by saying that the first step towards recovery in your e-commerce business is admitting you have a problem, but then anchoring yourself in the reality of what that problem is. Of course, again, as you're saying, part of the purpose of this podcast is to plug ourselves a little bit. And so I want to say, if you would like to anchor yourself in that reality for your business, go ahead, hit us up, commonthreadco.com, hit that hire us button. Give us a call. We would love to chat a little bit more.
I'll just say, like, so if you go watch on YouTube right now, I have the D2C Evolution talk, or watch my next episode this Friday for Sharpen Your Skills. And what you're going to see is that in most cases, what it's helping people to discover is that you need to take bigger swings. Is that the present system of just sort of like iterating on creative and trying to make some more ads next month and the same products isn't going to produce what you want. And so oftentimes what we're helping brands to do is to take a step back and go, shit. I had a conversation this week with one of our customers that, like, they're dissatisfied with their present state. And we sort of had this moment together of like, is the current product mix and current marketing campaigns and initiative going to get us where we want? And the conclusion was no. Like, we need to take a step back, and there's got to be a bigger swing here. We've got to reimagine the product. We've got to reimagine the demand system. It's all too paid media. We got to figure out, how do we get some organic into this pipeline? What would it be like to take a shot with a bigger influencer? How do we create a bigger campaign moment? How do we generate some PR? That's what it forces you to do. It forces you out of this like system that you're in that's kind of driving towards this continual degradation that you're out of. And it forces you to go, okay, I've got to think, I got to get back into that creative mode, that problem solving mode, that innovator mode that drove you to start the business in the first place. And that's helping brands create the necessary trigger to go pursue that line of thinking that I think is so critical to growth.
That's right. All right, folks. Well, I think that'll wrap it up for us this week. Appreciate y'all listening, and we will talk next week. See ya.